All right, thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. We are so excited to talk with Dr. Foston. But before we get started, we do want to just go over a couple of housekeeping logistics. So you are in a Zoom webinar. This is a little different than a Zoom meeting that you might be used to. So you cannot see yourselves and you cannot see your classmates, but you will be able to see the panelists who will be talking today. My name is Tori, and I will be working on the question and answer. So if you have any questions for Dr. Foston as you're listening, you can click on the question and answer selection on your Zoom bar, and we will save all of those questions and ask Dr. Foston at the end of our talk today. Let's see, what else is there? Oh, if you are watching from YouTube, you can send me an email. Since we don't have the questions live on YouTube, you can send me an email at vingle@wustl.edu, and we will also get those questions into the notes for Dr. Foston to hopefully answer by the end. We talk to last between 30 to 45 minutes, and we are excited for you to be here today. And I will turn it over to Jeannie now.
Hello, everyone. I'm sorry I have a fire truck going by, so I'm just gonna let that sound dissipate really quickly. Okay, so hi, I'm Jeannie Norris, and I'm an instructional specialist at the Institute for School Partnership. I am really excited to talk about how plants can be turned into plastic. That is our topic of conversation today. And we have Dr. Marcus Foston, who is an associate professor at the Washington University McKelvey School of Engineering. He works in the Department of Energy, Environmental, and Chemical Engineering. So I'm going to give him a chance to introduce himself first off. Dr. Foston, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yes, thank you. So again, my name is Marcus Foston. I'm originally from Atlanta, Georgia. I grew up there, and I went to college at Georgia Tech, Georgia Institute of Technology. I actually spent quite a bit of time there. I spent something like 13 years there between my undergrad, my PhD, and I worked there as a research scientist for a few years. So growing up, somewhere in the 10th year at Georgia Tech, my mom would always ask me what do I do for a job? And all I could come up with is that I was a professional student. And to a certain extent, that's true today, right? Like, even though I'm a professor at Washington University, I spend most of my time either teaching or teaching or learning, right? And so I'm still a student at heart, and so that's and I try to convey that to my students as well, right? That passion for lifelong learning. So I actually got my undergraduate degree in material science and engineering. So there's a wide range of engineering programs that colleges offer, and they're all somewhat interrelated. So as I went to my PhD, I still stayed in material science and engineering field or department, but I worked with a lot of chemists. I worked with a lot of chemical engineering. And this is just the way science is done now. It's very interdisciplinary, right? So you will have people in physics, chemistry, chemical engineering, mechanical engineering, all the different types of engineering working on very similar projects. And so since I've come to WashU, since I arrived at WashU, I started my own research lab. I teach two courses, one in the spring and one in the fall, an undergraduate course and the graduate course. And my lab really focuses on the conversion of plant material as a renewable resource to replace petroleum for the production of fuels, chemicals, and materials. And so, obviously we have expertise in all three of those areas. But today, what we'll be talking about, I think, mostly is the projects where my lab thinks about how to turn plants into materials or plastics.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that. Lifelong learning. I subscribe to that philosophy too. So I'm excited to learn with you today. So we're going to start by talking about what is made of plastic. I mean, plastic is a material. I'm sure if you've gone to the grocery store, you've seen some plastic bags. I think I'm wearing some plastic glasses right now, but let's talk about some other things that are made of plastic.
Okay, yes. Let me share my screen really quickly as well. This may help illustrate. Um, so, when we think about plastics, plastics are just simply polymers, and I think we want to talk a little bit more about what a polymer is in a second. But when we think about plastics, plastics are generally derived from petroleum. And then they go in their process, the petroleum is processed, it's separated, and then it undergoes a variety of different reactions to make a specific type of plastic. And those plastics are deployed into almost every, corner of modern life, right? So the plastic coating on your extension cord, right? If you think about your tennis shoe has plastics. A soccer ball has plastics in it, right? The rubber that's in your water hose, all of these things are derived from plastics. And so when we think about this, this has huge implications in the way in which we value our oil, right? I think a lot of people understand kind of the reasons why we might want to move away from oil, as it's a fossil fuel and it releases carbon dioxide. And there's a lot of issues with just the environmental impact of oil recovery and its utilization. But it's not as simple as just replacing gasoline. If we want to displace the use of petroleum, we need to also figure out ways of not only making biofuels, but then making materials that replace all of these different materials that we see in our everyday life. And we have to be able to do it with the same kinds of properties and quality, right? So we don't, just because it's a renewable plastic, we wouldn't want to sacrifice the performance of our tennis shoe, right? We wouldn't want tennis shoes that crack or that we can't dye or anything like that. And so my lab really works on how do we try to think about replacing petroleum in particularly high value applications like plastics without sacrificing properties and without appreciably increasing the cost.
Yeah, I hear you there. And so when you say it's made of oil, I mean, how does that even work? What is oil made of and why is it good for making plastic?
Okay, yes, that's a good question. So when we think about oil, right? Oil is actually plants, biomass that has been buried under the ground for millions or thousands of years, right? And so the earth has used heat and pressure to start to break down plant material, dead animals, to actually form oil. So for example, sorry, I went in the wrong direction. Oh, let's say it doesn't matter. But let's see here. I just want to show this one. So if we think about this, most of our fossil fuels, they came from buried animals and plants almost 150 million years ago. And again, this was where oil was buried under the ground. I mean, plants and materials buried under the ground and exposed to high temperatures and pressures. And it started to break down this material to form oil. Now, oil is actually a combination of a wide range of compounds, organic compounds, that then goes to a refinery, and that refinery then separates out those compounds based off of their boiling points, right? So one way to separate a mixture would be to boil them. Things that boil at low boiling points are going to come off first, and things that boil at higher boiling points are going to come off later. And so they do this process and separate out different fractions of the oil. And some of those fractions can then be reacted to form plastics.
Yeah, can you show that schematic of how the oil is processed? Awesome. Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, so in this particular case, what they're showing here is there's an oil tanker. Let's say we gathered a lot of oil from the ground, right? And it's filled up an oil tanker, and it delivers that to an oil refinery. One of the major processes that happen in an oil refinery will be distillation. And so I don't know if anybody's actually seen a picture of an oil refinery or driven by one, but you'll see these really large towers, these large stacks, right? Well, in that particular case, what you're doing is then you're boiling you're putting it into a boiler, putting the oil into a boiler, and then and then we put that into a large tower that has these trays on it, right? Things that boil at really low temperatures, those will go towards the top of our column. And so if we put a little tap at the top of our column and we start draining off what's at the top, it likely will be something that's a really light component, something that's very similar to petroleum gas or natural gas. It's not exactly the same thing as natural gas, but you know, for similarity, for some ease of description, it's something like natural gas will be at the top of our column. And then we would get things like gasoline somewhere towards this fraction of the column and so forth, right? So we get jet fuel for somewhere in the middle and on and on. And so this naphtha gasoline fraction, some of this is going to go on for gasoline production that goes into our cars every day. And then a lot of it, this naphtha fraction goes on to produce the monomers and then produce polymers that go into plastics.
So oil is this really useful sort of material that we can sort of take and rearrange and strip for parts and, you know, and make it into all these different products that we use to help our society function, basically. And so why would we want to replace plastic made from oil? What's the problem with that?
Right. So often we think about fossil fuels and we think about them running out at some point. And that is true, right? As I said before, petroleum, natural gas, coal, these are all produced over thousands of years of being buried under the earth heat pressure to convert. So that means the length scale, the time that it takes to produce that oil is so slow and our rate of utilization is so fast compared to that they're essentially non-renewable resources. Once we use them, they won't come back. Earth won't be able to make them again on a time scale that matches our use. So at some point we will use them up, but that's not the most pressing problem. There's estimates, for example, that there are, you know, a few 100 years, 500, 600 years of coal left, several hundred years of gasoline left in the earth. And these are just all based off of discovered resources. So there may be undiscovered resources of coal and natural gas and oil. But the biggest problem is the CO2 that's being released into our environment. So if we think about this, let's see if I can find it. So this plot right here kind of shows CO2 emissions as a function of Earth's history, right? So along this axis here, we can see our carbon dioxide concentrations and ppm. And so right now, we probably are somewhere with 300 ppm, and that's going to be right here. Now, as we go back in time, all these various lines on this graph are different projections. So we don't know exactly how much CO2 is on the Earth at 200 million years ago, but people can take certain types of measurements to look at buried CO2 within ice cores in different places. And then they can basically make models that then project out CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. So CO2 in the Earth has been very high at some points in the history of Earth, but none of those times have been when humans were on the Earth. And the idea is that we could make the Earth unhospitable for humans if we add too much CO2, because that would cause too much global warming. And so the question really that we're trying to address in a lot of our research when it comes to these renewable resources is, how do we prevent this CO2 release? And by using plants, there's a potential to do that.
Yeah, because I can see, like, you know, so what I'm hearing you say is that our plastic consumption as it is today uses a lot of oil, and this is contributing to global warming. But we need a lot of these products. And so, you know, we can maybe think about ways to make these products that are a bit more sustainable or not as harmful to our planet. Did I reflect that back? Because then we can think about, how do you make plastic from plants?
Yeah, so that's essentially it, right? The underlying theory here is that utilizing oil recovery of oil, utilization of oil ultimately leads to CO2 emissions, and that's harmful for the earth. So how do we then come up with ways to get around that particular problem?
Yeah, so that's the focus of your research. So can we compare and like, what is the process like of making plastic from plants? How does that compare to how plastic is made from oil? Like, why? I can't even imagine, like, I have some flowers sitting in front of me right now, and I can't imagine, like, how would we make plastic from a plant?
Right. Okay. So I think that leads us into maybe one of our what is a plastic? What exactly makes up plastics, right? So plastics are actually polymers. And, so plastics is just a common name for a polymer. You say, well, what is a polymer? So a polymer is a molecule that is actually quite long or big. It's made of several repeat units of a chemical or a chemical monomer, right? And so these monomers are then the units that make up a polymer. So let's think about polystyrene. Polystyrene is a very common plastic that we see in cups. And polystyrene is made up of monomers of styrene. And so it may be a little difficult to see because it's a little light. But at the bottom of this slide, you can see this is the structure for styrene. You don't have to really understand exactly, what all these wiggly lines mean, but just understand that this is a unit or it's a compound. And then what we do is we put this compound under chemistry, and then it links different different molecules of this same compound together to make a long chain, right? And so eventually what we've done is we've made this polymer from our monomer. And when we look at polymers, polystyrene, Kevlar, these are all types of polymers that we consider plastics. Right? But nature also does this as well. So nature also makes polymers. And so we can think about protein. A protein, the monomer in our protein is an amino acid, right? And what we do when we make a protein, is we link various or biology actually does this for us, links various amino acids together to make a long strand. And then these strands kind of bundle together. Right. And so when you start thinking about your muscles, if you think about your hair, all of these are forms of protein that have been strung together, or all forms of amino acids that have been strung together in proteins. And then those proteins have been bundled into larger assemblies that we see with our naked eye. Right. And so a lot of times what we're thinking about doing is we're thinking about taking plant material, which most plants are actually made out of polymers as well. It's called cellulose. And we take these polymer and we can either directly use it, right? So for example, an application for cellulose is paper. We take a tree, we strip away some of the other components of the tree, we leave behind the cellulose, and we make a material directly from the polymer that nature has already made for us. And we think about that somewhat. But one other option is to take the cellulose, let's break it back down into its monomer, which is glucose, and then let's figure out how to then rebuild a polymer from that glucose. Maybe we do some chemistry to change it into a different type of monomer, but then we build it back up into a polymer that has properties that are very similar to what we're already used to in our plastics. So how do we replace polystyrene with a monomer that's produced from, let's say, glucose?
Wow. Okay. So you're taking glucose, which the plant, that's like the raw, a sort of raw product of photosynthesis, and you're building it back up into something that can be used as plastic?
Yeah. So we can do it directly, right? So we can take glucose itself, and we can think about how we might try to rebuild another polysaccharide. Sometimes what we do is we actually feed glucose to a microorganism. And microorganism will eat that glucose for energy and carbon. And it will also then it will produce a material for us. So let's say we want to make a protein, then it will convert that glucose into that protein. Let's say we don't want protein, so from that microorganism. I have colleagues in our department who will genetically engineer that microbe to get it to make some other type of product that's also either a monomer or a polymer that we can then utilize. Or another option would be to take that glucose and let's do chemistry to it. So like my lab is really interested in doing chemistry to these types of materials. The reactants of that we apply to the glucose fundamentally change its structure. So it no longer looks like glucose, but it looks now more like something that could polymerize into a plastic.
Wow, my mind is blown by that. That is really cool. I mean, so it sounds like, we found this amazing solution from nature, from living things, where instead of, taking this styrene and building it up into polystyrene, it's like you take the polymer and you make it into a monomer and then you make it into a polymer again. So you're kind of hacking, Mother Nature here. And it sounds great. And so what are there any limitations or drawbacks of using living plants to make these products?
Yes. So one of the things that we're really interested in is how plants develop these really specific structures, right? So cellulose is one of them. But then there's other biopolymers that you might find in most common plants. And evolution is this process where a plant starts to develop the structures that resist deconstruction, right? Like, what's the point of having a tree that just falls apart as soon as you hit it with a little bit of chemical in nature, or you apply a microbe to it, right? Like, so life is really really amazing at kind of designing structures over really long periods of time. That's evolution. So plants are what we call recalcitrant, which basically means difficult. They're just difficult to break down, and this is by design, by nature. And so the real question is, how do we take this plant material and how do we then extract out its constituent components, right? How do we extract out the cellulose from the other components without wasting a lot of it or using way too much energy or using like really nasty chemicals, right? And then once we get, and then, nature is making making cellulose. It's not making it for us to make plastics, right? It has a really specific function for the plant. And so it doesn't necessarily put it into a really convenient form for us. Glucose may not be the most convenient monomer to make other types of plastics. And so we have to do a lot, again, to then get the carbon that's in the plant, which may be in the form of glucose or something else, or cellulose or something else, into a form that then can produce a material that is very similar to what we get out of oil. That's not easy at all.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So what are your favorite types of products that you've researched, or like something that's the most interesting to you? Like, what do you make out of these bioplastics?
Right. So we've made a variety of different types of products out of it. But one of the criteria for making these bio materials is that, one, it has to have functionality that is just as good as anything that we could get out of oil. It can't be inferior mechanical properties or inferior properties in general, right? So, for example, the sun chips, they have a bag that you can make out of material that you can extract from plants, and they were actually able to make commercially a bag that was completely renewable. And it held the chips really well. It didn't break open. They were able to seal it so that the chips stayed, fresh for a really long period of time. But the bag itself crinkled, and the consumer rejected it completely. Right? Now you may say that seems silly, but these are the types of things that we have to worry about. So we have to be able to make a material that is just as functional. We have to be able to make a material that doesn't cost a tremendous more to make. And we have to make one that doesn't have a higher environmental impact. So even though we're using, let's say, a plant as our starting material, if we have to use a ton of power if we have to use a lot of nasty chemicals to get that plant into that plastic, then we're not really helping the situation at all. We might even be making it worse. And so we have to think about all these kind of broader considerations as we start to design our process. And so one of the things that where these types of materials have a really high application is in a lot of biomedical applications, right? So we think about biomedical things that you're putting inside of your body. People aren't super concerned about the cost. They're like, I just want it to work really, really well, right? Things that we get out of plant material are also quite biocompatible and often biodegradable. So they're really useful for things that you can put inside of your body. And so one of the things that we've been using is that we can extract out some components of the plant. We can make glucose and we can feed that to microbes, and those microbes will make genetically engineered proteins. Now, my colleague does that. We don't necessarily do that component, but those genetically engineered proteins are the basis for adhesives that can supplement sutures in your body. So you have an ACL tear, and the way they right now repair that tear is just to sew that ACL back to your bone. But those sutures tend to fail quite often. So what you might want to do is apply an adhesive, a glue, essentially. Well, we can make a protein as essentially a glue, and we can produce that from glucose that we get out of plants. But then that adhesive is actually not quite strong enough. And so one of the things that my lab has started to do is like we can extract out parts of a plant that is called a cellulose nanocrystal. So it's a small crystal that comes out of the cellulosic component of the plant. And we can then mix that with the protein. And we do a little bit of tricks to make the protein and the cellulose nanocrystals interact in really strong ways. And all of a sudden we go from having a glue that's kind of brittle, and even though it's biocompatible, we can put it in the body and it has really high adhesive properties. It's a little brittle, it likes to break. We add in the cellulose nanocrystal, all of a sudden it makes this material super strong. And now it becomes a really effective product for, let's say, supplementing sutures and various bone tendon repairs.
Wow. Okay. So biomedical applications and sunchip bags, which I've experienced the sunchip bag, they are different. They feel different than like, a Dorito bag or something like that. And I latched on to something that you said that I think we could dive a little bit into, which is biodegradability and environmental impact. So how do plastics made from oil compare to plastics made from plants in terms of like environmental impact after the product is made,
Right. So this kind of brings us back again to life and evolution, right? So on Earth, we have these microorganisms everywhere, and they evolved in the context of plants. So even though these plants have ways of resisting deconstruction from these microbes in the environment, these microbes are also well equipped to break down plants, particularly as they die and they fall over, right? And so for something to be biodegradable, microorganisms have to have had some exposure to them for the millions of years that they evolved. Now, petroleum is something that we got out of the ground, and even though it was processed naturally, it's not something that a lot of microbes know how to process, right? So if it's something that comes from oil, it's usually toxic to life, and it usually can't be broken down by microorganisms in the environment. So that means that when we make those plastics, it relies solely on kind of chemical degradation pathways that may take hundreds, if not thousands of years to break down. And in fact, what happens to a lot of the plastics that we derive from petroleum and we put those into our environment is that they don't necessarily break down and get metabolized or go into any kind of cycle. They just keep breaking into smaller and smaller pieces. And in fact, it's likely that by the year 2050 that there'll be more plastic in the ocean than there will be fish, right? Now they're just being really small pieces. And nanoparticles most likely, but it still will have a huge environmental impact, right? And so what we want to do is now, if we can start with something like if we use something like a protein, if we use cellulose that's now like a nanocrystal cellulose, these things are still very similar to their native form in the plant or in life. And microorganisms have the ability to then break those down. And so, for example, if we are able to make a really useful plastic out of cellulose or make something really useful out of proteins, then we can put that into a landfill and it will eventually be broken down because microorganisms have the tools to handle those.
Yes. Oh my gosh, I love this topic. I mean, this is really interesting because we just got a couple of student questions in that I think are kind of related. You mentioned nanoparticles and nanoplastics, and I've heard a lot about that in the news and, thinking about like things like biomagnification. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what are nanoparticles even and like why should we care about the fact that they're in the ocean?
So nanoparticles just mean that they're really small, right? So if we think about the nanometer, if we think the it's hard to visualize, let's say, a bond length, but a single carbon-carbon bond, if you got 10 of those together, that would be a nanometer, right? So we're talking about really small length scales. And this changes the way particles behave, actually, as you get to really small length scales because you have so much more surface area, right? And so we have these nanoplastics. They first start off as just regular plastics, but because of mechanical, maybe some chemical degradation, but because of a lot of mechanical action, they break down and they break down further. And so what we'll find if you take a sample from any soil sample or water or ocean sample, what you'll likely find is some significant component of pollution that is either micro-sized particles or nano-sized particles of plastics that just continue to kind of break down in the environment. Right? It's nothing that we can visually see, but it's a tremendous amount of it there, and it has a huge impact on not only kind of like our like aquatic and terrestrial life, but even on human health.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about this. And I mean, so it sounds like that plastic from plants can be a part of that solution to help decrease those harmful nanoparticles that are in the soil and in the water.
For the most part, yes. I mean, I don't want to say it's a panacea, right? There is ways in which we can modify the plant material, plant derived plastics, so that they aren't easy to break down either. And so we have to be very careful about one, understanding what types of materials can be broken down, and then trying to design those into our plant derived materials, or at least at a minimum come up with better ways of handling our plastic waste, which would be applicable whether we're using petroleum-derived plastics or plant-derived plastics.
Right. So it's not a cure-all, but it's a piece of the puzzle. So we have some more student questions. We were going to talk about, your daily life as a scientist, and there are some questions related to that. So kids are wondering, have you made any plastics in your lab? Do you grow plants for your research? Like what does your day and your work look like?
Okay. So my day is, so I actually have a research group that does a lot of the hard work. So I really actually go in the lab. In fact, they hate for me to go in the lab because every time I go in, I end up messing something up. Right. So I don't do a tremendous amount of work in the lab anymore. I spend a lot of my day, interacting with my students, helping them solve problems. Right. I try to teach them how to solve problems, and it's not necessarily straightforward. Right. You have to like think about how do you analyze the problem? How do I understand all of the components of the problem? And how do I take information from other sources? Right. Not just from my own experimentation, but from what other people have done in the surrounding field. How I take all that information, I put it together to try to come up with a unique solution to whatever problem they're facing, right? And I spend a lot of time training them on that aspect of things. And then I also spend a lot of time teaching students. And so I teach classes. And so I interact with my students either in the class or outside of the classroom. And then I also think about the next project. Right, I'm spending a lot of time thinking about what's the next cool thing that we can work on. I spend a lot of time reading and teaching myself about new aspects of that project, what other people have done, and then formulating plans that I can then deploy in proposals. And so those are kind of that's kind of my day-to-day operation.
Well, it sounds like fun to me. And so we have another question sort of related to the cost, the economics of plastic. So this student is wondering, what is the cost comparison between petroleum-derived plastics and plastics derived from plants?
That's a great question. And this is a broader issue, not just for plant-derived materials, but biofuels and biochemicals, chemicals and fuels that are derived from plants as well. The reality is that we have been using petroleum to produce our fuel, our chemical and materials, for over 100 years. We know how to do that really, really well, actually. We know how to pull oil out of the ground really well. We know how to get it from one place to another place. We've invested in that infrastructure, right? Like the pipelines that we have, the shipping that we have. I know every day you probably drive past a tanker that has gasoline in it, right? We've invested huge amounts in that whole process of getting oil from the ground into your car or producing it into plastics. And because we're so good at it, it's really cheap, right? Comparatively, right? So when we try to do this from plants, we actually know quite a bit about how to do this, but we don't know how to do it cheap enough to outpace petroleum, so that so that a consumer would choose that product over, let's say, oil. So we know that consumers are willing to pay a small amount, maybe 5% more for something that's renewable. But that's even kind of niche types of things. Like if it's something that you use every day, like gasoline, people don't want to pay extra for that. And I can totally understand that. And so a lot of what our lab does is, yes, we look for novel solutions, but we also look for ways in which we can come up with solutions to make biomass to finished goods cheaper.
Thank you. Yeah, any other student questions? Students, don't be shy. If you have questions, you're welcome to add them to the Q&A. I wanted to follow up with one more question. Why are you interested in researching this topic? Why does it speak to you, and what got you here, and why do you think that people should care about it?
Well, as an engineer, I always wanted to, as an engineer, we generally gravitate towards large problems that need solutions, right? And, I looked at this area. This is one of the largest problems that we could think about, right? We're thinking about issues that affect our health, the issues that affect our environment, and it is really complex, right? You have this plant material that nature has designed in a really specific way, and so you have to understand that. You have to understand. So I have to do a little bit of biology. I have to understand a little bit about how to do conversions. So I understand things about chemistry and chemical engineering. I have to understand about how to build new materials, and so again, some chemistry, some chemical engineering, but then material science. And in all of these areas, I can stick my hands in. I can learn a little bit about each one of these. And it just keeps me going, because it's like I'm learning something new every day.
Yeah, so it sounds like it really speaks to the values that you talked about to begin with, that you really love learning. And this is kind of a cutting edge field where there's a lot of stuff to learn and to figure out. Sounds fun to me too. All right, so do we have one more question? Okay, so, great question. What is the time frame for taking plants and creating the plastics? Like, how long does it take to make these products? And can you do this on a small scale, or do you need a big fancy lab to do it, or a big refinery like the oil products need?
Well, I mean, these are all really great questions, and they kind of lead into the type of economics that a process can have, right? Depending on the route that you take, it can take a different amount of time to go from plant, let's say, material to, let's say, fuel or chemical, right? Or material. So a lot of times we think about chemical processing, using heat, reactants, catalysts to do reactions. These are often processes that are very quick, that don't take a large footprint, but they aren't quite selective, right? The material that we produce it usually ends up making a wide range of different products, and then we have to figure out how to separate and purify. However, we can use biological processes, right? As I said before, we can take a microbe and we can genetically engineer it to make a lot of different things downstream. You can make these very selectively, but these often take much longer. These processes usually take a lot longer, but they are more selective. And so often we have to mix and match various different approaches to get to the kinds of products that we want with the kind of purity and the time scale to get to those products. So a lot of what we're doing is kind of engineering. In engineering is balancing competing interests and criteria.
Interesting. All right. Well, these have been some great questions. And I think we are winding down to the end of our time together. I just want to say I learned so much. This was super interesting. I hope that all the students found it very interesting as well. And I'm going to say thank you very much, Dr. Foston, and I'm going to turn it back over to Tori.
Thank you, Jeannie and Professor Foston. This was a great talk, and I learned, just as Jeannie said, I learned so much. Teachers and students, thank you so much for attending today. The recording will be live on YouTube, it will be on YouTube. The link was in the Zoom registration, and we can send that out if you have any questions or can't find that link. We will be back next year with SciZoom, so keep an eye out for that as we prepare for the next year. And so thank you, everyone, and we hope you have a great end of the year and a great summer. Take care.
See you next year.